In the quiet farming outskirts of San Miguel province, the Reyes household was known for two things: discipline and kindness. Daniel Reyes worked as a school teacher, while Clara managed administrative work at a nearby clinic. Their two children, Mateo and Andres, were bright, polite, and raised in a home where education and responsibility were treated as non-negotiable. It was not a wealthy family, but it was stable, predictable in a way that made neighbors trust them without hesitation. So when Sophia entered their lives, it didn't feel like a disruption. It felt like an extension of something they already believed in. Sophia was introduced through a local community referral, a teenage girl with no reliable family structure, no consistent guardians, and a history that came in fragments depending on who was asked. Some said she had been drifting between relatives. Others said she had been working in unstable domestic arrangements since childhood. What everyone agreed on was simple: she needed help. Clara was the first to suggest bringing her in. Daniel was cautious at first, but not resistant. Mateo and Andres were immediately sympathetic. They were close in age to her, and they saw her less as a stranger and more as someone who had simply been dealt a different kind of life. Sophia herself arrived quietly. She did not ask many questions. She did not push for attention. Instead, she observed everything: routines, habits, emotional patterns. She learned quickly where she fit into the rhythm of the house without needing to be told. At first, it worked smoothly. Meals were shared, school schedules aligned, conversations were polite and structured. Sophia helped around the house, kept her space clean, and rarely caused conflict. To outsiders, the Reyes household had done something admirable. They had taken in someone vulnerable and given her structure. But inside the house, something subtle began to shift. It started with a tension, not dramatic or obvious, just slightly uneven. Sophia would speak to Clara privately after disagreements, framing things in ways that required interpretation rather than clarification. Small misunderstandings between Mateo and Andres began to surface more frequently, usually after Sophia had been involved in the same conversation. Daniel noticed it first, but he didn't name it. He assumed it was adjustment. A new personality entering an already established system often created friction. Clara interpreted Sophia's behavior differently. She thought the girl was sensitive, possibly traumatized, and reacting to perceived rejection. That interpretation made her more protective, and that protection changed the internal balance of the home. Sophia did not demand authority. She didn't challenge anyone directly. Instead, she positioned herself where she could receive reassurance from each member of the family at different times. Over weeks, this created a pattern where each person in the house felt individually responsible for her emotional stability. Mateo began defending her in small disagreements. Andres began avoiding direct confrontation with her. Clara began adjusting her tone when speaking to her. Daniel began spending more time trying to understand her perspective. Without any visible conflict, the structure of the household began to reorganize itself around Sophia's emotional presence. Still, nothing seemed alarming enough to intervene. Then came the shift. Arguments became more frequent, but never fully traceable to a single cause. Tensions rose, then dropped, then resurfaced in different forms. Sophia remained calm throughout most of it, rarely raising her voice, rarely escalating directly. When accused or questioned, she often withdrew instead of responding aggressively. That withdrawal created a different kind of tension, silence that felt unresolved. By the fourth month, the Reyes household no longer felt unified. It felt segmented. Each member experienced a slightly different version of reality depending on their last interaction with Sophia. Mateo believed she was misunderstood. Andres felt increasingly uneasy but could not explain why. Clara felt emotionally responsible for keeping peace. Daniel felt like he was constantly trying to interpret a situation that kept changing shape. Sophia remained consistent in one way only. She never fully aligned with any single person for long. Then, one evening, everything changed. It was an ordinary day on the surface. Daniel was away attending a school meeting. Clara was at home. The boys were in their rooms. Sophia was inside the house as usual. There were no signs of external disturbance, no alarms, no warnings, just a sudden collapse of normality. When neighbors were alerted later, they described confusion more than clarity, raised voices, a moment of silence, then emergency calls. By the time help arrived, the interior of the house had become a controlled scene of tragedy. What had happened inside was still unclear, but it was evident that the violence, whatever its origin, had not been random, and Sophia was the only person left alive inside. By the time Daniel Reyes got home, the street outside his house was already blocked off. Neighbors stood in clusters, speaking in low voices, trying to piece together something that still didn't make sense. The house he had left that morning looked unchanged from the outside. Inside, it was something else entirely. Police were careful with what they said at first. There had been a violent incident, 2 victims, a survivor. The details were still being processed. Daniel heard enough to understand that his world had already split into before and after. Then he saw Sophia. She was sitting outside the house, wrapped in a blanket, hair damp, hands steady in her lap. Not injured in the way he expected, not panicked in the way he feared, just quiet. When she looked up and saw him, she stood and walked toward him slowly. "They came in," she said. "I hid. I didn't see everything." That was her statement, simple, clean, repeatable. Inside the house, investigators were already noticing that the physical evidence did not fully align with that version of events. There were no clear signs of forced entry consistent with the break-in scenario. Certain areas of the house showed disturbance, but not the kind typically associated with unknown intruders moving through a space under pressure. Instead, the pattern suggested movement that was more familiar than chaotic. Rooms were not searched randomly. Paths inside the house seemed to follow a structure. That detail stayed in the background at first, not strong enough on its own to shift the narrative, but it was enough to prevent immediate closure. Sophia's account remained stable in interviews: unknown attackers, sudden violence, fear, hiding, shock. That consistency initially worked in her favor, but investigators began focusing on something else entirely: timing. Digital records from devices in the home showed activity that did not fully match the sequence she described. Messages had been sent during a window where she claimed to be concealed. App usage patterns suggested presence and interaction when she stated she was hidden and unaware. It was not definitive proof of wrongdoing, but it introduced contradiction. Then came the behavioral analysis. Sophia did not display the expected emotional profile of someone who had narrowly survived an external attack on their household. Her responses were controlled, measured, and unusually consistent under repeated questioning. Stress responses were present, but not aligned with the severity of the claimed experience. Investigators did not treat that as guilt. They treated it as a discrepancy worth expanding. The turning point came when inconsistencies began stacking instead of appearing in isolation. Phone metadata indicated communication activity linked to an external contact during the critical time frame. Not extensive, but enough to establish interaction. That external individual was later located and questioned separately. Their version of events did not align cleanly with Sophia's account. The overlap was partial, but the contradictions were important. At that stage, Sophia was brought back for deeper questioning. The tone changed, still professional, but no longer accepting her narrative at face value. Investigators began presenting her with specific time segments rather than general questions. For the first time, her certainty wavered. She adjusted her timeline slightly, then adjusted it again, small corrections that gradually changed the structure of her original statement. Eventually, the unknown intruder's explanation became less central in her responses. It was replaced by fragmented references to internal conflict, emotional pressure, and escalating tension within the household. Nothing she said was fully stable. Each version shifted slightly as more facts were introduced. What emerged was not a clear confession in a single moment, but a gradual breakdown of the original narrative into something more complex and internally driven. The legal process that followed focused heavily on intent, responsibility, and the blurred line between emotional escalation and deliberate action. The court examined not just what happened, but how the situation inside the home evolved over time. Public reactions split sharply. Some saw Sophia as fully accountable for a calculated outcome shaped over months of shifting dynamics. Others saw a teenager operating within a fragile emotional environment that had spiraled far beyond anyone's ability to control. What could not be disputed was the end result, a household that had started as an act of compassion and ended in irreversible loss. In the aftermath, the Reyes home remained empty for a long time. Eventually, it was sold, but the reputation of what happened there never fully faded. And even years later, people in the town still return to the same question, quietly, without ever agreeing on the answer. At what point does a person stop being part of a family and start becoming something no one recognized at all? In the small coastal town of Maryville, life moved slowly enough that everyone noticed everything, yet somehow missed what mattered most. The McGuire family was one of those households people described as well-raised and fortunate, the kind of family that seemed steady from the outside, almost too perfect to question. Patrick McGuire was a school administrator. His wife, Helena, worked in education support services. Their two children, Aaron and Daniel, were bright students, disciplined, respectful, and known for doing well in school. It was the kind of household that gave off stability in a place where stability was not always guaranteed. Then there was Eliza. She arrived later. Eliza's entry into the McGuire home did not begin with suspicion, it began with sympathy. She was introduced through a community outreach program, a teenager who had no stable family structure, no clear guardianship, and a history that was deliberately left vague. The details were always softened when spoken aloud: difficult childhood, temporary care arrangements, a need for stability. That was enough for the McGuires. Helena was the one who initially suggested helping her. Patrick agreed after hesitation. Aaron and Daniel were supportive almost immediately, seeing her as someone their age who simply needed a chance. Eliza herself was quiet at first, observant, careful with words. She did not ask for much, which made her seem easier to trust. Within weeks, she was part of their daily routine: meals, school runs, conversations in the living room that stretched into late evenings. People in town praised the McGuires for taking her in. It looked like compassion in action. What no one saw was how quickly the emotional structure of the home began to shift. Eliza adapted fast. She learned patterns, routines, weaknesses in tone and timing. She understood how attention moved inside the household and how to position herself within it. She did not demand space. She created situations where space was given to her. At first, it was subtle: a comment that made Helena reconsider a decision, a small misunderstanding between Aaron and Daniel that required clarification, a private conversation with Patrick that no one else was included in. Nothing dramatic, just enough to shift balance. By the third month, Helena began noticing that arguments in the house often seemed to start after Eliza had spoken, not because she was openly hostile, but because she framed things in ways that caused interpretation rather than direct conflict. Still, Helena dismissed it as coincidence, adjustment period, teenage tension. Patrick saw something different. He thought Eliza was simply sensitive and needed structure. He spent more time speaking with her directly, trying to guide her, unintentionally giving her more individual attention than anyone else in the house. That attention became a quiet point of tension between Eliza and Helena. Aaron and Daniel, meanwhile, began to experience a shift they could not properly explain. Conversations that once felt natural started feeling measured. Small disagreements with Eliza left them unsure whether they had misunderstood her or whether they were being unfair. Eliza never raised her voice. She rarely argued directly. Instead, she would withdraw, become quiet, and allow others to fill the silence with guilt or confusion. And it worked. By the fifth month, the household no longer felt unified. It felt divided into smaller, unstable emotional clusters that constantly shifted depending on who had interacted with Eliza most recently. Helena began keeping distance. Patrick increased engagement. The boys alternated between frustration and protectiveness. Eliza remained consistent throughout it all, calm, polite, present. Then came the incident that changed everything. It happened on an ordinary evening. Patrick was away on a short work trip. Helena was home with the boys and Eliza. Nothing unusual was expected. Dinner was routine, conversations were minimal. But later that night, something went wrong inside the house. A disturbance, a sudden breakdown of silence. When emergency services were contacted, the initial report was confusing and incomplete. A break-in, multiple victims, panic, a survivor who was uninjured but visibly shaken. When Patrick was called, he was told only that there had been violence at the home. He rushed back immediately. By the time he arrived, the house was already sealed off. The front yard was crowded with officers. The interior was controlled and silent in the way only a crime scene can be. Nothing felt familiar anymore, even though everything was still in place. And then he saw Eliza. She was standing outside with a blanket around her shoulders, wet hair, clean face, calm breathing. Too calm. When she noticed Patrick, she walked toward him slowly, as if she had been waiting for that exact moment. She said the words clearly. "They attacked us. I hid. I didn't see everything." Inside the house, Helena and one of the boys were gone. The other was found later. The scene inside suggested extreme violence, but details were withheld from the family initially due to ongoing investigation. What was clear, however, was that the attack had been severe and deliberate. Eliza's explanation remained consistent: unknown intruders, sudden entry, chaos, fear, hiding under a bed until it was over. She repeated it calmly to police as well. But investigators noticed something early that did not fit neatly in. There were no clear signs of forced entry that matched her description, nothing conclusive, but enough inconsistency to delay full acceptance of her account. Then came the behavior patterns, the timing of her online activity, the messaging activity from her account around the estimated time of the incident, and most importantly, the lack of emotional reaction compared to what would be expected from someone who had just experienced what she described. Still, suspicion alone was not enough. For now, Eliza remained the only surviving witness, and in cases like this, the only witness shapes the entire direction of the truth. The investigation had just begun. In the days that followed the incident, the McGuire household stopped feeling like a home and started feeling like a sealed room. Nothing moved in a natural way anymore. Conversations were short, always cautious. Even silence had weight. Eliza stayed with relatives arranged through social services while investigators continued processing the scene. Officially, she was a surviving witness. Unofficially, she was the only person whose account shaped the entire direction of the case. At first, her statement remained unchanged. She described unknown intruders entering the house. She repeated the same sequence every time she was asked. She emphasized fear, confusion, and hiding. She avoided speculation about timing or details she could not directly confirm. But investigators were not satisfied with repetition alone. They began focusing on what was measurable instead of what was said. Phone records were the first break. Eliza's device showed activity during a critical window that did not align with her claimed timeline of hiding. Messages had been sent, deleted activity logs were partially recoverable, and app usage suggested she was awake and active during a period when she had claimed complete concealment. None of this proved intent, but it contradicted her narrative. Then came the forensic inconsistencies. The entry points of injury patterns in the victims suggested a level of familiarity with the interior space that did not match a random intrusion scenario. Movement within the house appeared controlled rather than chaotic. There were signs that someone inside the home understood where people would be located. Investigators also noted something more subtle. The absence of forced disturbance in key areas of the home contradicted the idea of a sudden external break-in. Drawers and objects were displaced, but not in a way consistent with urgency or searching behavior. It looked staged in parts, though not perfectly. As pressure increased, Eliza was called back for additional questioning. This time, the tone shifted. Still calm, still composed, but more structured in approach. Investigators did not accuse her directly. Instead, they tested contradictions. What stood out was not panic, it was control. She answered carefully, paused before key responses, repeated phrases she had used before, but when asked about specific moments within the timeline, her certainty began to weaken slightly. Not enough to collapse her account, but enough to expand doubt. Meanwhile, investigators reached out to digital contacts connected to her account. That was when the second layer of the case began to surface. Messages between Eliza and a peer she had been communicating with over a longer period showed a pattern that was not visible earlier. The tone of those conversations revealed growing resentment inside the household environment, particularly toward Helena, who had been the primary authority figure. There were also indications of planning behavior in abstract form, not direct admissions, but discussions about changes, problems that needed removing, and frustration with feeling controlled or displaced. Individually, none of it constituted a confession. Together, it suggested emotional escalation that had not been outwardly visible to the family. When confronted again, Eliza changed her position slightly. She stated that she may have misunderstood the timeline, that she was overwhelmed, that memory gaps were possible due to shock. This introduced a different problem for investigators. If her memory was unreliable, her testimony lost strength. But if her memory was selective rather than damaged, it raised an entirely different category of suspicion. The turning point came from one final piece of evidence. A recovered fragment of deleted communication from the night of the incident showed coordination that contradicted her original claim of being alone and hidden. It placed her in active contact with another individual during the critical time frame. That individual was located and questioned separately. Their statements did not fully align with hers. Pressure shifted rapidly after that. Eliza was taken into formal custody for further interrogation. This time, inconsistencies could no longer be explained as confusion. Investigators presented a structured timeline that directly conflicted her original account. Faced with the breakdown of her version of events, Eliza eventually stopped repeating the intruder narrative in its original form. Her revised statement introduced a different reality. She described emotional instability inside the household, feelings of isolation despite being included, conflicts that escalated internally rather than externally, and finally, a chain of events that unfolded inside the home without outside involvement. She did not present it as planned, she presented it as something that spiraled beyond control. The legal process that followed focused less on a single moment and more on intent, influence, and responsibility. The court examined not just actions, but the psychological environment that led to them. The outcome divided public opinion. Some viewed Eliza as fully responsible for what occurred. Others saw a young person shaped by instability, emotional manipulation, and escalating internal conflict within a fractured household. What remained undisputed was the result: a family destroyed inside what was meant to be a safe home, and a survivor whose account had shifted from protection to implication. In the end, the McGuire house was sealed and eventually sold. The neighborhood moved on, as it always does, but the story stayed behind in fragments. And in most retellings, one question always returns to the center. How does a place built for safety become the exact reason it is lost?